On the issue of payment security, it's it is a pretty important role that the Grain Commission has played, but everybody recognizes that the licensing and bonding system doesn't work. So the licensing and bonding system means, in order to buy grain from farmers, you're supposed to be licensed with the Canadian Grain Commission, and as part of the licensing process, you have to post a bond, and it's literally a big wad of cash that the Grain Commission just sits on. And so there's lots of estimates out there now of how much extra financing and extra money this is going to free up for the grain trade by moving to a different system. So they're not taking away licensing, they're not taking away payment security, they're just going from a bonding model where you just have to post this money there in case you go broke and haven't paid for the grain. Then there's this pot of money to pay the farmers for the grain who have delivered but not been paid for it yet. They're going to move to a system of third-party insurance. So when I say it didn't work in the past, that refers to those situations where maybe 50 cents on the dollar is all that some farmers received for the grain that they didn't get paid for. Now, then there's been all these other situations, for example, recent bankruptcies in the hog feed mill sector, where the hog barns weren't able to afford the high prices of grain. There were, and went bankrupt. There were many cases there where farmers didn't get paid, and for whatever reason, historically, feed mills were never required to be licensed. So I think, now the most common phrase used about this change is that they're modernizing the Canada Grain Act. And that's a real good phrase for it, because, this is 100-year-old legislation. It has been changed a few times since then as the grain industry has evolved, but really the changes that they're making to the Grain Act today could end up being quite a bit more significant than the changes made just getting rid of the wheat board monopoly. The Grain Act truly was the one established to protect producer interests. The Grain Commission really has always really had the teeth and the depth and the leadership to take charge of policing the whole grain trade. And I think, I think it's safe to say that the intent has always been to have, to protect producer interests. And so today, that's probably, when they're looking for industry consultations, or when they're, farmers that might be interested in commenting on that, that would be a good aspect to look at it from. Where do I need to be protected? Where in this supply chain and with which different partners am I doing business with where there are risks to my business? And in this case, you can't think about risks being, well, maybe wheat's not going to be $8 a bushel next year and I won't make as much money. That's a short-term grain marketing risk management risk. When I'm talking about risks, it's like, a good example is feed mills. Why isn't there any method of payment security for them? Why isn't there any way for me to be protected or to have recourse besides going to the receiver, in a situation like that? Do I need to demand payment every single time I deliver a load of grain before I dump it in order to be protected, or how can this, how can this system work to protect against, sort of those long-term things that are always going to be there irrespective of the price environment? That's really what we need to get into the new Grain Act. Now, the legislation is, it was just a little piece of this budget bill, and it's, there are some major changes to the Grain Act in it, but I would guess that, the Grain Commission is very open to receiving ideas on lots of aspects of its business. It's just, you just have to understand that at the bottom of this is cost cutting. The payment security is an obvious one and I think they've got probably an easy fix there. So there isn't too many issues about that, except we would want to make sure that they were looking at licensing every grain buyer out there and not just particular sectors. We might want to look at, some kind of licensing tracking system for containerized shipments, because containerized grain, flax is a good example, represents a much bigger portion of exports than before. And that is another thing that people maybe don't realize about the Grain Commission, is they're the ones who do most of the data reporting. They certify every shipment of exported grain, and so that puts them, and they license all the handling facilities. So for licensed elevators, they report their stocks, and that's a really important piece of information that analysts and anyone who's developing forecasts can track on a regular basis. It's really, really useful, to know how much have farmers delivered this year compared to the same time last year. How much grain has been exported to China this year versus last year, and then that's really key stuff, key information. So the more, in my opinion, the more space and the more areas where the Grain Commission is involved in tracking shipments, then we can get more data and more information out of that, and that is a very, very good thing. That's the kind of thing that you need to have in place in order to have a transparent and well-functioning open market. So that's this change comes right on the heels of the change to the wheat board legislation, because the two things have always been linked very closely, especially in the last 30 or 40 years. The Grain Commission and the Wheat Board have always worked very closely together. So you can't really take away the Wheat Board monopoly without making these whole hog modernizing changes to the Grain Act. But, again, I think when the dust settles, we will see much more broad, sweeping changes as a result of the changes to this act than we did last year. And again, when we come back to what do? Okay, well, we're in a pretty good position to say what do farmers need out of the marketplace. So here's a few examples. Sometimes we run into issues with contract performance. If a farmer doesn't show up on time with the grain, there's penalties. If a buyer doesn't take delivery of the grain, there are not really any penalties that we've been able to find. Now, you get out a contract, and that's a legal issue. But you can't really convince a farmer that it's a wise use of money, because it's not, to go and try to sue a grain company for not taking delivery of a couple loads of grain. I mean, so there's no recourse. And it doesn't happen very often, but it happens more often when prices fall, that a farmer has a contract for a particular delivery window. Let's say it's November, December, and on January the 15th, we're phoning up the buyer saying, can we bring that grain in right now? And they say, oh yeah, no, I'm not really ready for it yet. The rail cars aren't here, or my buyer's backed away, and I'm looking to find another place to sell it. So, like in there's been cases where 6, 8, 10 months have gone by, and the market. This is particularly the case in special crop markets. I'm thinking of '08. The market's all tanked, and we were sitting there with no cash, storing the grain, carrying all the quality risk, way past the contract delivery window. Is there any recourse? No. You could walk away from the contract and try to sell it to somebody else for 10 cents a pound less, but that's not really a great solution either. So, let's talk about those things. User fees. Everybody knows that the Grains Commission's user fees, if they go from 50 cents a ton to $1.10 a ton, that's just going to get worked back into the basis, and the farmer's going to pay for it. We all know that. If that's what the Grain Commission needs to do, I'm pretty sure that the trade will figure out which of those services are really worth paying for and which ones they don't need to do. I don't think they're going to get away with hiking the fees too high on stuff that is mandatory. So maybe there should be, there's probably be a healthy dialogue about that, how much of the Grain Commission's work should be mandatory and how much of it should be voluntary. That conversation is starting to happen, and it's fascinating to listen to. There's a lot of really smart people on both sides of that debate, and I think they'll figure it out. And whichever of these fees that aren't necessary, can't afford it, they'll fall off, and anything else is just going to go back to farmers. So, do farmers need to talk about user fee increases at the Grain Commission? No, I don't think it's necessarily relevant, or do you even have an opinion on it? Why would you bother? But on the issue of contract dispute resolution, that's an area where I think it wouldn't take very long before you could build a long list of producers that have found themselves in that situation. And I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair that if the farmers don't deliver on time, that there's penalties and all kinds of stuff, and if the buyers don't take delivery on time, that there's nothing that we can do. Maybe the government or Grain Commission or all the producer associations that aren't talking about that right now disagree. That's fine, but that's my opinion. That's one area where I think that farmers, there may be an imbalance of power.